We'll go ahead and get started here. So welcome. I'm Dr. Eric Wesselmann, psychology professor here at ISU, also a full-time nerd. And I love when I'm able to talk nerdy with lots of other cool people. So it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our special guest, Mr. David F. Walker. Mr. Walker is an award-winning journalist, a filmmaker, comic book writer, media scholar, and expert storyteller. He has authored comics in various genres for several major comic companies, including DC, Dynamite, Marvel, and Image. He is co-writer and co-creator of Naomi for DC Comics. He has a forthcoming book, Identity, Illusion, and a History of Black Representation and Participation in the Movies. Before we fully get underway into the panel, I want to make sure and acknowledge the various folks who helped fund Mr. Walker's visit. The Harold K. Sage Foundation, the Normal Theater, the Black and Brown Comics Arts Festival, Northern California MLK Foundation, ISU's Department of Psychology, Foundation Fund, ISU's Office of Equity and Inclusion, and the Woonsook Kim College of Fine Arts. Without further ado, please help me welcome our special guest, Mr. David Walker. Yeah, so today's panel is going to be celebrating. We're going to be celebrating Mr. Walker's comics, and I have several co-panelists I'd like to introduce. My fellow co-panelists, as I introduce each of you, please tell us a little bit about who you are and your first exposure to David's work. We'll start with Ms. Farhia Osman.
Yeah. Hi. I am a third-year doctoral student in the school psychology program. I'm born and raised in Minnesota and here as a fellow nerd and loving to talk nerdy. And I will preface that and say, I admit that I thought my first experience and exposure to your work, Mr. Walker, was from another colleague of Eric is Dr. Scott Jordan, and he was telling me about Bitterroot. He's like, oh, like this book, I think you'd like it, and thinking about the upcoming ReggieCon panelists and such. But I was like, yeah, that seems great, and I put it to the side. I was like, I'll add it to my to-read list. And then it wasn't until after, once I was invited to go to the panel, I was like, oh, I've actually had read your Power Man and Iron Fist comics, because after Luke Cage came out, I was like, okay, I need to go into all depth of anything that's been written about this character. And so I was like, oh, it's been such a long while, so it's been nice to come back into that work as well as reading some other work. So yeah.
When you said when Luke Cage came out, I was like, Luke Cage came out, and then I realized.
Luke Cage came out, and he came out. Congratulations, Sam. Yes.
All right, well, thank you, and thank you for joining our panel. And our other co-panelist is Dr. Stanford Carpenter.
Hi, I'm Dr. Stanford Carpenter. I am a cultural anthropologist. I'm based out of Chicago. I was supposed to meet you before I was working to become doctor, and then I met you while I was doing my research.
Actually, by accident. We was like,
yeah.
Or something like that.
Yeah, it was strange. I am also the co-teacher for the class. Can you dig it? And I am chair of the Black and Brown Comic Arts Festival, which is it started as a small comic convention focusing on people of color in San Francisco as part of the Martin Luther King celebrations, and we branched out into doing satellite events all over the place, like in Chicago, etc. And then also we do a lot of sponsorship and organization of panels at comic conventions. And so yeah, I mean, I honestly, David, sometimes I can't remember when we actually first met. I just know that we were supposed to meet a whole bunch of times in the 90s, and then we just never met. Like, we had people who would tell us, oh, you have to meet David Walker, and then it just didn't happen. And then finally, when I was doing my research, we bumped into each other, and then we're like, oh, and I know that person, and I know that person.
Well, I remember in 2011 going to San Diego Comic-Con, or it might have been 2012, it was probably 2011, because that was I think the first time I met John Jennings in person, and I think you were there. And one of the things that I remember, because there was a man named Dwayne McDuffie, who was a famous comic book editor, writer, and then he wrote for animation. And he died in February 2011. And so that was that year. I remember specifically, like, the black creatives that were at San Diego Comic-Con and the nerds. They were sort of this collective stunned daze because
Yeah.
it was almost like he wasn't our leader or our king or anything like that, but aside from the fact he was nearly 7 feet tall, everybody literally looked up to him.
Right.
And so I do remember, in fact, I think there's pictures, it was you, me, John, I want to say
David Brown.
David Brown.
I still got that picture.
Yep, and so that was, in my mind, that's the first time I think I was ever in the presence of everybody all at once, and it was kind of like, for me, it was like, oh my God, those are those guys, you know, and in that space, I call it the black nerd space, like, everybody, to me, it feels like everybody knows who everybody is, but that doesn't mean we've actually met.
Right.
And so I'll often say, hey, say to somebody, do you know John Jennings? It's like, oh, I know of him, or I know his work, and I'll be like, well, what do you mean you don't know him? Let's call him right now. Look at John, hey, you know. And then meanwhile, this kid is screaming in the background. He's like, I ain't got time to talk, you know. But it was a small enough world then, you know, and that was 13 years ago. And in fact, I think today is it was either today or yesterday was the anniversary of Dwayne McDuffie's passing. It's a small enough world that we kind of all knew each other, even though we weren't in the same space.
It's funny, I think one of the first times I heard your name was when
Someone was talking about, who was a jackass.
no, it was actually when I was in Portland.
Oh,
and
okay.
I had this comic strip that I was trying to sell called Tales Retold,
Mm-hmm.
retelling folk tales, and I took it to the Willamette Week.
Okay.
And I'm forgetting the name of the guy, white guy with a beard. Well, that doesn't really know that much in Portland, Oregon, but he was like either the editor or the publisher, and he was the one who looked at folk tales from around and said. The pitch was it was folk tales from around the world,
Mm-hmm.
and his comment was, well, I don't know if we can do that because that seems like more of a niche market. And I was like, folk tales from around the world? And then we were talking, and he mentioned your name.
Okay.
That was like, I think that was the first time I heard your name. And then I was like, who is this guy? When I went back over to the Oregonian where I was working, and I remember Marty Hughley was like, oh yeah, I know who that guy is. And that was like how it started. And then I remember we tried to get together, and then we just like shoot 2 ships across the night.
Small world, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a very, very small world. And what I would like to do, I've asked each of my panelists to prepare a question for you. We will ask a couple questions, sort of warm things up, then we can open it up to the audience, and then just see where things go. So I guess to sort of start things out, though, tell us a little bit how you entered the small world of comics, your origin story.
Man, okay, so I mean, I loved comics when I was a kid, and back then, they were dirt cheap back then. They were 25 cents each, and they were everywhere. They're not everywhere anymore. But back then, you could go to a grocery store, you could go to a supermarket or the pharmacy. There were newsstands everywhere, and I grew up. We didn't have a lot of money. But my mom would always have a quarter, and for a quarter she could shut me up, right? And at the same time, the daily newspapers, almost every daily newspaper except for the New York Times, they didn't have a comics section, but most of the newspapers did. So, every day the newspaper would show up at my grandparents' house, and so every day there was comics that I could read, and I literally learned how to read. Most kids are learning how to read with like Dr. Seuss books or the Bernstein Bears, whatever. But I was learning how to read with the comics that were in the newspapers, and obsessed with superheroes because at the time there was an animated Spider-Man show that was on in syndication, live-action Batman was on in syndication. So I knew who superheroes were. My mom recognized that interest. And so she cultivated, and again, it was 25 cents to buy me a comic book. I would shut up and read it over and over and over again. And then my cousin would get comics and we'd trade them back and forth. And then part of the story that I had only remembered very recently, there was a girl that I went to elementary school with, And her dad was a syndicated cartoonist. His name was Dick Cavalli. I, for the life of me, can't remember what his comic strip was, but he was really tight with Charles Schulz. Charles Schulz was one of his best friends. And so Tori Cavalli, who I went to elementary school with, brought her father in for show and tell in 2nd grade, right? And he's explaining what he does for a living, and he's talking about making cartoons, and he had all these original Peanuts cartoons that Charles Schulz had drawn. And so here I am, 2nd grade, probably, 7 years old or something like that. And it was like, I was like, oh, you can do this? Like most people think of things like that as something magical. You open up a comic book and like, most people don't always think about how did this get here. But the moment I realized that this guy who's standing in front of me, the father of this girl I'm going to school with, makes these things, and he's friends with the guy who does Peanuts, which at the time was my favorite comic strip, I was like, oh, I guess I can do this, you know? And that was the beginning of the journey, which, you know, had a lot of bumps along the way, a lot of detours. But from a really early age, I mean, I loved telling stories, I loved writing. I started, none of it exists anymore, but I started writing my first, like, action adventure stories, like, in the 1st grade. I had a whole story about a team of scientists that lived underwater in this underwater biosphere thing, and they kept getting eaten by sharks, and every story was like the sharks got in and killed them. And like, I wrote my own Planet of the Apes stories because I was obsessed with the Planet of the Apes movies. And then it's just, and then now here we are 100 years later, and I'm still obsessed with all that stuff, so. Yeah.
And you've got to work on some of those properties, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Worked on Planet of the Apes a couple times. Probably won't ever work on Planet of the Apes again. You'll have to cut that part out.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I don't mind. Fox.
It's so funny that you talk about like it being such a small world, because I think the big thing when I was reading and also like looking into some of the work and looking at the acknowledgments and who is written around the space, and you were mentioning names, I'm like, oh, like I remember reading these people during a Afrofuturism class that I took, or during a like Harlem Renaissance class that I took, and recognizing how small and recognizable the space of Black comics and Black comic artists and people within that space, and really, it's feeling very surreal in that sense.
Well, and it's not even, it goes beyond that. I mean, it's like, film and television, it's small enough that like, even if, it's definitely not 6 degrees of separation. It's more like maybe 3 or 4, but if you're, you know, I feel like I'm pretty fortunate, a very fortunate person that I'm down to like 1 or 2 degrees of separation. But there's a point in the 90s where I was publishing my own fanzine, and that was part of how I got back into comics. Actually, was because I started going to comic conventions because I was told by another zine publisher. For those of you that don't, if you don't know what zines are, they're what blogs and podcasts were before the internet. It's just like your own little homemade magazine, right? And so I was publishing one. And Eric Nakamura and Martin Wong of Giant Robot, which was another fanzine, said to me, you know, you should start going to comic conventions, because like there's nobody there selling zines, and there's always people there who like brought their kids to the comic convention and are not interested in comics. And so that was kind of how that was one of the ways I really got into that world. And so Dwayne McDuffie, who even at that point was like a rock star of that world, I remember walking up to him, and again, the man was nearly 7 feet tall. It's like, oh, hi, Mr. McDuffie, I'm a big fan. Here's my name's David Walker. And he was like, yeah, I know who you are. Come on, walk with me. And that was it. And like, it was him and Dennis Cowan was there, all these guys with Milestone Entertainment. And like, I learned a very valuable lesson at that point, which was you should never underestimate who might know your work, even though you don't know that they know your work. And and so that was it. It was like, there was, like, I didn't have to know a secret handshake or anything like that. I was creating stuff already. These guys whose work I respected and aspired to knew who I was because they knew the work that I was doing.
That's really cool. That's really cool. So, Farhia, you want to continue on with the question?
Yeah. I feel like I have a bunch, but I would say thinking about going back to like, I think a natural progression and thinking about you starting off. I know that you've written a lot of works, one are inspired by like the real characters from existing media. We were talking about how like I read your Power Man and Iron Fist work, as well as characters who are like historical comics, and then also original characters. And wondering, what is your process as you go through in your creation of writing, and how does that differ between the different people? Like, I was wondering, I was like, I don't want to say characters, I feel like that seems like not the way that I want to portray it, but how does your portrayal of like the subject matter and also what you're writing about, especially when you're thinking about you are writing for something that's existed before or something that's original?
Well, the first step is always procrastination, putting everything off to the last minute. But fortunately, my preferred form of procrastination is research, right? So, you know, when we're looking at some of the stuff up here, you know, whether it's like Power Man and Iron Fist, or Power Man and Iron Fist is probably the best example, because here are two characters that were both created in the 70s. They were comics that I read when I was a kid. I went back and I reread a lot of that stuff. And I read as much stuff as I could get my hands on with those two characters. And then sort of made up my mind of like, okay, well, who are they? Like, you know, Luke Cage had hundreds and hundreds of comic book appearances, same with Iron Fist. It's like, yeah, but who are they? Like who are they going to be to me as I write them? And I kind of do that with everything. Like, I need to get to know the characters, and the way you get to do that, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, is you spend a lot of time reading. When I wrote the Frederick Douglass book, you know, I struggled with that book. I read as many things as I realistically could read about Frederick Douglass, and was trying to write the book, and it was terrible. And I talk about this in the introduction. It was terrible because I was writing it. Frederick Douglass spent his whole life trying to restore the humanity that was deprived of him, right? And everything he wrote was written in the first person. So when you're reading, the most comprehensive stuff you're ever going to read about Frederick Douglass came from the pen of Frederick Douglass, right? And so I'm writing this nonfiction book, and it's dry and it's boring as hell. And I finally reached out to my editor and I said, you know, I gotta write this book in first person, which I did not want to do. But I was like Frederick Douglass, like the only way to try to convey that humanity is by emulating what he did. And so then the book took a different direction, and so then I had to spend a lot of time rereading Frederick Douglass again and figuring out, okay, how do I condense, how do I paraphrase, how do I make this, you know, how do I take what to the Negro is the 4th of July, which is a famous piece that he wrote, which was, you know, probably 20 pages long, and how do I condense it into 2 paragraphs, right? But it's a lot of it is research, and then a lot of it is about, at some point, just going, okay, I've got the confidence to give these characters the voice that they need to have. And again, so like, if we go back to Power Man and Iron Fist, with Luke Cage, I had this decision. I was like, Luke Cage is the one superhero in the Marvel Universe that every other superhero would love to team up with. Like, he's the most dependable guy there is, and everybody wants to work with him, and I'm gonna write him that way. And then I was like, whereas Iron Fist is kind of a flake, and he's, you know, he can get the job done, but he's irresponsible. And it all came down to, and we were talking about this maybe over dinner, I can't remember. No, it wasn't, I'm sorry, this was, whatever, my memory's bad, but we were talking about certain aspects of characters that get lost over the course of time, especially if they're legacy characters of Marvel or DC. And in the original runs of Power Man and Iron Fist, there's nearly a 10-year age gap between Power Man and Iron Fist. Luke Cage is in his mid to late 20s, and Iron Fist was only like 18 years old. And I was like, oh, they're not brothers so much as they're like, Luke might think of Danny as his brother, but Luke is Iron Fist's dad. Like it's a father figure. He's the classic orphan who lost his dad at an early age, and that was the decision I made, was to write them that way. Was to write them that secretly Luke Cage is Iron Fist's father figure, and Iron Fist is sort of the annoying nephew, kid, brother, or whatever. And if there was any success in what I wrote, it was that decision that I made. And with Frederick Douglass, it was the decision of like, I'm writing this as a continuation of the need to not just exert and restore his humanity, but to restore the humanity of every black person in America. Because that's what part of what we're suffering from is this continued dehumanization. That was a long-winded answer.
All
too.
good. The way that I phrased the question was very long-winded, and you got different pieces that I was asking from it.
Stanford, do you have a?
Yes.
He fell asleep.
No, it's okay.
Yes, it is a 3-part question, and it's expected to be a long-winded answer.
All right.
Okay.
3 parts.
And
You want to give me all 3 at once?
Yeah, I'm going to give you all 3 at once, and that's the reason why, because I want to hear how you parse this out. Okay, so and it starts with like typical like questions that you ask people who are fans of comics, right?
Okay.
Okay, so the first part of the question is, who is your first favorite superhero?
Okay.
The second part is, who's your first favorite black superhero?
Okay.
And then the third part is, who is the superhero that you first acknowledged as representing your black experience?
Okay.
So that's why there's a progression there.
Progression. Okay, so my first favorite superhero, there was 2 of them. It was, and this is very important though, that we keep this in mind. They were Batman and Spider-Man, but they were Batman from the live action TV show from the 60s. It was on in syndication when I was a kid in the 70s. And there was the animated Spider-Man, okay? Those were my 2 favorite superheroes.
And the other part is why for each of them.
I think because I was just a goofy kid who, the shows were fun and entertaining. They were over the top. It's like, why do any of us, what cartoons do we like? Well, this was the one that was on, and Spider-Man had a catchy theme song, and Batman was cool, and but by the time I was actually reading, I would say Spider-Man was definitely my favorite superhero, and over a progression of time, part of the reason I fell in love, I guess, with Spider-Man, there's a couple of reasons. One is just the character was endlessly fascinating to me, but there was a daily Spider-Man comic strip. So you could actually read Spider-Man every day, right? So that was a huge part of it. Now, my favorite black superhero is kind of a weird answer, because my favorite black superhero is not a black man or he's a superhero, but he wasn't black, which was Fantastic Four, The Thing. And in my mind, he was this big orange rock, or a bunch of rocks made him up, and everybody treated him like a monster and like he didn't belong. And in my mind, I was like, oh, that's what it means to be black. It's like you don't belong. I grew up in this town, small town, predominantly white town. I never felt like I belonged. I always felt like I was being treated like I was a monster. And so I really related to Ben Grimm. That was the Thing's name. His his true self was Ben Grimm. And so I really and then the Hulk also as well, because the Hulk was always angry and pissed off, and he wasn't white. The Thing was an orange rock man. The Hulk was this big green thing, right? And so in my mind, as long as you weren't white, you might as well be black, right? That was kind of my rationale. And as a kid, I had a lot of anger management issues. I had to go through a whole anger management program. When I discovered Luke Cage and the Falcon right around the same time, and I kind of liked them, but it was also funny because my cousins and I were like, do black people really talk like this? Especially with Luke Cage, because it was, God, I'm trying to remember who was writing all that. Archie Goodwin, I think, was writing a lot of that.
And then Tony Isabella.
Yeah, Tony Isabella, and hey, they did an okay job. It's clear they, at least one of them had read some Chester Himes or something like that. But it was like, reading black superheroes was fun because it was like, is this what they really, do they really think we were like this, And then as I got older, it was like, yeah, I'm gonna destroy some of these myths. I want to break some of these myths down. And then the third question was, what was the third part of
The
the question?
first superhero that you identified as representing your black experience.
It's a really good question. I still come back to, and in a lot of ways, I always thought of Spider-Man, Peter Parker, as, in a lot of ways, he was, and this was kind of crazy, but this is the mind of it's sort of the mind of a child, right? Peter didn't have parents. He was raised by his Aunt May, who was clearly old enough to be his grandmother. And the only kids I knew who didn't have a mother and a father and were being raised by older relatives, every single one of them that has grown up around, they were all like black or Latino, mostly Puerto Rican. There were some Dominican kids where I grew up. And so in my mind, it was like, yeah, Spider-Man's kind of almost black, right? Like there was that mentality. This is the mentality of a 6 or 7-year-old. This is how I equated this sort of stuff. And I think, when Brian Bendis went on to co-create Miles Morales, the new Spider-Man, like he hit on, for a white Jewish guy from Cleveland, Ohio, he hit on what a lot of black kids saw in Peter Parker and Spider-Man, which I think Stan Lee hit on too. I mean, Stan Lee had talked about how, under the mask, Spider-Man could be anybody. And that was sort of that's what made that character in a lot of ways revolutionary, because so many superheroes had at least part of their face was exposed. Batman, part of the face was exposed, so you knew he was a white guy, right? Superman, whole-faced, knew he was a white guy. The Fantastic Four, 3 of them, you could see their faces. The rocky orange guy, he gets a pass, right? Because the moment you stick out, and like in my mind, the moment you stuck out and were sort of an oddball, you, like, as a kid, to me, it's like, that's it. Come join the club, So, I'm trying to think if there was ever a black character that I really felt spoke. In my youth, there wasn't one. As I got older, I'm sure there were some, but it was that they were always caricatures, right? They were caricatures, and now knowing as much as I do about the history of comics, it was like, none of them were being written by black creators. Most of them weren't being drawn by black creators. And so again, the Thing and the Hulk were as black as Luke Cage, and maybe a little bit more authentic in their blackness, because they were merely being written as outsiders or as the other, right? And really, that's all. For me, that's all I needed, was a sense of what it means to be alienated, and not to also have to call everybody a jive turkey or something. So, did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Anyone else on the panel want to?
Yeah, so this is kind of inspired by reading both Number 13 and Bitter Root side by side.
Okay.
And recognizing, you talked a little bit about with like the Thing and the Hulk, the idea of monsters, the monstrous as a way that spoke to the black experience, your black experience. But with the Number 13, really seeing some of that, the aspect in the ending, kind of communicating this is just a space for the mutation as like the monsters that we are coming out, in a sense. You can correct me if I read it incorrectly, but try and remember what the quote was. Whereas with Bitter Root, really seeing the monster as these are the monster and in the like negative things that lurk within people. And so, long-winded answer of like prefacing, with those two side by side, and also thinking about your work within your work and also going forward, where your thoughts in the idea of a monster, and how do you go about balancing those two ideas of what monsters mean, whether that means representation or the aspect of horror?
That is a great question.
I had to set it up.
So I have this little side project I've been working on, and right now I just call it the Black Monsters, right? And I've got, there's a movie in the 70s called Blackenstein. It's a blaxploitation version of the, Frankenstein monster, and it's a terrible movie. It is in the top 10 worst movies I've ever seen in my life. But it's one of those movies that's so bad that you can't help, I could not help but create my version of Blackenstein. I spell it different, so it's Blackenstein, the monster of Blackenstein, not to be confused with Blackenstein. I think the Frankenstein monster is one of the most tragic characters of all time. I think the Wolfman is a very tragic character. I think most monsters are tragic characters. And it's interesting to me that we treat these monsters as if they're the problem, and they're not the problem. The problem is society as a whole, right? And so I was sitting around not that long ago and I was thinking about it, and I was like, man, if I could have just done Blackenstein myself. And I was like, well, why not? Why not just do your version of Blackenstein? And why not do your version of the Wolfman? And why not do your version of Dracula or something along those lines? That's not Blackula, which is, by the way, a great movie from the 70s. There's a movie called Blackula. Dracula's soul brother, blacker even than he. And so I started coming up with this idea of this monster universe or these monster characters that are all of them are black, but really exploring what it I loved the monsters when I was a kid, and I think part of the reason I loved the monsters when I was a kid was again because I couldn't articulate the sense of alienation that I had growing up, being one of the only kids of color in a predominantly white space. But the older I got, we've all experienced those moments where it's like they treat you like you don't belong. They treat you like a freak. They treat you like a monster. And then the ultimate culmination of it, and really a lot of what this got me thinking about was, and it wasn't just the death of George Floyd. It's been so many people for years before and years since, but in 2020, after the death of George Floyd, there's something about that murder especially that really got me, and as it got to a lot of people obviously, and that was where I just sort of started coming up with this idea of monsters that are the most likable, that at least black people will read these things and be like, yo man, this is just like me. I am just like, and I'm playing with it. So the Dracula character is Big Daddy Kane does a song called Count Macula, and so, but I had a character years ago called Count Macula. He's the vampire pimp, and I was like, he represents that side of blackness that is nothing but the negative, that embraces all the negative stereotypes, and then his arch nemesis is I'm calling him Jimmy B, but he's, what would have James Baldwin been like if he was Blade the Vampire Slayer, right? And so, it's like I have this vampire slayer who's James Baldwin, who talks like James Baldwin talk, with the mid-Atlantic accent, and long drawn words, then all of a sudden really fast. And in my mind, as I'm writing, and I'm trying to come up with the perfect name for him, right? But it's like, okay, James Baldwin spoke out against so much of the idea of what blackness, the negative sides of blackness, he represents that in this monster thing that I'm doing. Then you've got Count Macula, then you've got the monster of Blackenstein, and there's all this other stuff. But I love monsters. I love monsters because this is what I was taught, not by my family, not by my friends, but by the outside world. And I think that so many of us are taught that we're either the monsters or there's something wrong with us. And right now in society, it's primarily, young trans people, young queer people that are being taught that there's something wrong with them. And it's like, no, it's not that there's anything wrong with you. It's this other group of people who are so insecure with who they are, they have to pick on you. I mean, we're a nation that was built by people who were being bullied. So they ran away from the people that were oppressing them and then started a land where they could oppress other people. I mean, it was a nation built by the Puritans. It says it all. They were Puritans. They hated everything and everyone. Everyone hated them because of who they were. So they came someplace where they could practice their hate. I said it better.
It's on the recording.
Yeah, I'm playing back everything I've said. Oh my God, I'm in so much trouble.
Don't worry, they'll be playing it back on YouTube.
Yeah, I know.
I have a follow-up question to that.
Sure.
I mean, talking about the Black Monster, or talking about the monster in Blackness, I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about the superhero and Blackness. You and I have had some conversations about that, about what is a different, what makes a superhero, and then what happens when that concept collides with race.
Well, superheroes are largely, by and large, they're extensions of the accepted norms of law and order in this country, right? And law enforcement. Law enforcement and law and order are not, they're not the friends of black people for the most part, right? They're tools of oppression that have been used against us. And so I've had this argument plenty of times. I've written superhero stories, and I still write them, and I like them. But at the end of the day, you have to accept the fact that, if a superhero is by extension, Batman is basically a deputized agent of the Gotham City Police Department. You gonna tell me that in Gotham City they ain't shooting and killing unarmed black folks? Because they're doing it everywhere else, right?
Right.
So, by default, Batman is working with an organization, a type of organization that has had a long history of the oppression and the brutality against people of color, right? And so, I remember talking to some folks at Marvel. They wanted me to write a black superhero, and I was like, to me, a black superhero is immediately going to be the villain because he's going to be fighting against the systems of oppression that keep black people down. Now, the systems of oppression that keep black people down are also the same systems that maintain law and order, but the whole system of law and order was designed to keep the slaves from rising up against their masters, right? And after the Emancipation Proclamation, after the war, during Reconstruction, everything that was built in this country to maintain law and order was not meant to maintain law and order. It was meant to make sure that the rich white people held on to the power that they had and that people of color were kept from having power. And that's it. And so at the end of the day, at some point, you have to look at superheroes and go, okay, now the thing is that because most comics don't have black people in them at all, you just don't see, Batman is always beating up, either the supervillains or the criminals of Gotham City. And the fact of the matter is most artists just don't draw black people. But I have a feeling that if Gotham City was a real city, it would probably have the highest black population in the US. And then you would see, every issue, you'd see Batman beating the hell out of black people and then getting sued because he'd be a racist. I don't know, did that answer your question? You know the camera's rolling, and that's why you're asking me some of these things, so I can get in trouble.
You're speaking honestly, at least, though.
Well, yeah, because I'm getting older, and I don't know how much time I have left, and I have to just say what's on my mind. And here's the thing: if me talking about cartoons and comic books really pisses people off, that's your problem, because there's other things that are far, far worse. And if you can't, at least we can all have our own opinions. What I'm talking about are my opinions. Are they right or wrong? I feel they're right, but someone may come along and challenge me and be so compelling in their argument that I go, yeah, you know what, you're right. I never quite thought about it that way, but yeah, maybe it's okay that the police shoot first and ask questions later, and that we never get a fair shake in a court of law. Maybe that's okay, but no one has come up with that compelling argument yet. So there. I'm not talking to you, by the way. I'm talking to the camera. You're sitting behind the camera. So I don't want you to think like all my ire was being directed at you. Did you have another question? Or?
I did.
Okay.
So one of my favorite authors is probably Toni Morrison, who's since passed away. And one thing that she talked about is how in her books there were no white people. White people were not the focus of her story. She said, I'm here to tell the black story, and the black story does not need to contain white people. Now, when it comes to comic books, especially as we talked about like the Hulk and the Thing, there's always some form of that, of white people in it.
Mm-hmm.
Even Black Panther being put on screen, it was, this white agent that came in and saved the day in some way, shape, or form. In your opinion, do you think it is important to have white people in a story, especially regarding what you were talking about, like systematic and things that can apply to the country as is?
I don't think you have to. I tend to, just because that's sort of and part of that is a reflection of the world that I grew up in. I mean, I grew up always in these spaces where I call them these little pockets of blackness, which was always my family and some of the neighbors, but it was always this larger, predominantly white world. But I think that, no, I think you can, I think the most important thing is that you tell a story that's truthful, right? That is so, that the honesty is there. And if you can tell a story honestly about some aspect of the black experience in which white people aren't part of it, that's fine, right? It's crazy. About a year ago, we were clearing out the house that my grandparents built back in the 1940s, getting ready to sell it. And we're going through all these old photos, and it was me and my cousin, and we're going through these photos, found all these albums, and it was like, we kept running across these pictures of white people. And, so my mom was the only white person that I ever saw at my grandparents' house, right? So my father was a black man, my mother was a white woman. My mother was the only white person I ever saw at my grandparents' house. That was like my oasis largely my oasis of blackness. And so we're going through all these family photos, and there's all these pictures of like white people at my grandparents' house. And I said to my cousin, like, who are these people? And we were talking about it, and we were like, we never saw white people other than my mother. We never saw them. And so it was like this weird thing. It was almost like, ew, white people came into grandma and grandpa's house? Like why? Why would they, And it was, like, to me, it was always the safest place for me as a black person, especially as, back then, there was no concept, no one used terms like biracial or multiracial or anything. It was like, you were either black or you were white. You had no choice. I was like, the high yellow kid at the end of the block, right? And so it was interesting to me because it was like, oh, even this world that I would have said at one point, if I was to write a story in which there was no white people in it, or maybe just one, being my mom, it would be around my grandparents and that world, that neighborhood we lived in. And then I come to make this discovery that that wasn't the case. It was like, they had a wedding reception at their house for some white family, and I'm like, who were these people? Like this had to have been like the late 50s, early 60s. It was way before I was born. But I was like, and there's nobody left who can tell us. There's no, the older generation, everybody's gone. But so it was just odd to me. But I think that if you have that story to tell it. Like, Toni Morrison, I always mangle the quote, but if there's a book that you want to read that hasn't been written yet, you need to write it. If there's a story that you want to tell that's all about, I recently saw the new version of Color Purple. There ain't a lot of white folks in it, You know, that's part of what I love about it. And then when they show up, it's like, oh, painful. It's like, with the exception of the guy who's delivering the mail, everyone else brings misery, right? I think it's interesting that in both film versions of The Color Purple, there's essentially, there's the white woman and her husband who arrest Oprah's character in the original movie, and then there's the guy who brings the mail. And so the one guy who brings hope to Celi's life is the white dude. I find that interesting, right? I don't even know if the guy had a name, and I can't even remember, but if you're telling a story, you just gotta be honest with the story itself. And only you as a creator can figure out what that is. And I wrestle with it all the time. Do you have any questions? Do you have any questions?
Along with that, I guess, somewhat similarly, like reading your afterword in number 13, I think my main thing that was reading is like you were approached about to write this story where there was no plot. And you're like, I just know what the characters are, and I know kind of like what happens in the beginning and the end, but there isn't really a story there. And wanting to hear more about what your process is like when you want to tell a story. You're like, a story is important, but what parts, I was like, this is a half-formed thought in question, but what is in your writing process, the most important part to you? What do you value in the sense of you were then challenged to create a story out of no plot, but you still wanted to write that story in a sense?
You know, I think just about every story I ever have written, no matter how it came to me, was never a story when it came to me. It was an idea. And we were talking about this earlier. It's, you know, you finish your first draft, and then you write 37 more drafts, and then you have your story, and then you discover your theme. You discover, you know, these stories talk to you. I'm working on a graphic novel right now that I thought it was about one thing, and then it turned out it was about something else. And I can't tell you the exact moment that I figured out it was about something else, but it just hit me all like a ton of bricks. And I was like, oh, this is what it's really all about. Okay, let me just keep writing, let me finish it, make a note that this is what it's all about, and then go back and fix it, fill in the holes, fill in the gaps. But I think it's an organic process. I think that stories grow and evolve. I don't think that anything I've ever written is totally me. I think the story exists as energy, right? The story exists as experiences. The story exists in the people that we know or that we've heard about, and then they come to some of us, and then we begin to process it through our own filter, and then it evolves, and it's a constant state of evolution. And so for me, I can give you a general idea of what I'm writing, what it's about in the moment, but by the time I'm done, it's going to be about something else, and it will have expanded. And if there's any success in my career, it's been that I allow it to become what it needs to become. I think a lot of creatives are so concerned with it being what they originally thought it was going to be. I thought this was going to be a romantic comedy. No, it's really a Southern Gothic horror. Okay, let it become a Southern Gothic horror. Let it become what it needs to become, as opposed to trying to force it to be something else. Your stories and your ideas are your children. Would you force your child to be something other than what it is? You know, and we see that now with a lot of, we've seen that for a long time. I want my kids to be this way, to be that way, as opposed to, no, let your kids, give them guidance, feed them well, you know, show them love, and then let them grow up to be the people that they need to be. And somebody said to me, he said, you know, you can have 4 kids and you can feed them all the same soup, but they're not going to grow up to be the same person, right? And that's it. You feed them soup. Make sure there's some protein in it and not too much sodium.
Well, we're running close to time here. I want to make a couple announcements before we completely wrap up. We have some other events that Mr. Walker is going to be involved with. So after we leave here from 3:30 to 4:30, there's going to be a comic book signing at Graham Cracker Comics in Uptown Normal. So you can chat with Mr. Walker Moore, get something signed. From 7 to 9:30 tonight, we're going to have a screening at the Normal Theater of Mr. Walker's documentary on 1970s blaxploitation films called Mac, Hammered, Slaughtered, and Shafted. So there'll be an introduction to the film, and then there'll be a panel discussion afterwards. Next week, Mr. Walker will be here virtually for February's ReggieCon, which will be focused specifically on Bitterroot, which was discussed a little bit today. And you can buy copies of the Graham Cracker and get them signed.
So that is the 27th, because there was some confusion the other day. I was like, oh, man, I'm going to take a picture of this just
So, and for those of you who are in my classes, I'll post that as well. There's some another event, which I'll let Dr. Carpenter talk about real quick, which Mr. Walker will also be at. So, Dr. Carpenter?
Oh, yes. So tomorrow at the Chicago History Museum, we will have we're going to have another screening of of David Walker's documentary. And afterwards, there's going to be a conversation. Well, beforehand, there'll be a nice little reception. So if you want to get a few nibbles and and a little bit of alcohol, well. It's illegal. That's not right at all. But it will. But afterwards, there's going to be a conversation between David Walker and Panam Rami. Panam Rami was actually in several blaxploitation films. He was one particular film, which is my favorite. He had a bit part in The Spook Who Sat by the Door. So we did do a pre-conversation between David and Mr. Rami, and if the conversation afterwards is anything like that, you will really enjoy your time. Also, we just got word from at the beginning of this week that the Black and Brown Comic Arts Festival is a small comic convention. I had mentioned it earlier that happens during Martin Luther King's birthday in San Francisco. But we were contacted by USA Today, and we've been nominated to be one of the 2024 a contest to be 2024's top art festival. And so if you're interested in helping us out, you can go to their website and you can vote for us, because you get nominated and then you got to vote. And as you know, being from Chicago, I very quickly checked the rules, and you can vote once a day, every day. So, because it's an online thing. And if you had multiple devices, it allows you to vote multiple times a day. So in the Chicago tradition, I have this to say: vote early, vote often, and we really would appreciate your support, because this would be a chance for us to get some recognition, but also for our cause to get recognition, which is really important, because we are about creating spaces for Black comic creators and creating spaces for young boys and young girls of color to be able to come and see and see comics as something, not just something that someone else makes that has pictures of them, but to see comics as something that they can create and see it as an opportunity to tell their own stories.
To my panelists, my guests, Ms. Osman, Dr. Carpenter, Mr. Walker, thank you all very much for your time. Thank you to the audience, and
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you, camera, people watching. Thank you, camera operator.
I just voted. You guys are 5 of 20 for the Black and Brown
We need more
comics.
devices.
Yes, we
More
do.
devices.
Excellent. So thank you all.
Thank you.